And our next conversation is really relevant, extremely relevant to the industry and world today. Since PVC pipes are the single largest users of PVC resin, trends in pipe use is a critical market indicator. And frankly, how COVID is impacting on municipal water utilities and their future infrastructure is of critical importance. If water utilities are canceling or delaying capital improvement projects or delaying replacements of aging pipes, those decisions are really going to impact our industry. So joining us today to discuss this topic is Richard Anderson, Managing Director, U.S. Conference of Mayors and the Water Council. Richard will be discussing research from the U.S. Conference of Mayors related to the 2007 to 2009 recession and what we can learn from that recession for today's ongoing recession. So Richard Anderson is a member of the senior staff at the U.S. Conference of Mayors, serving as Director of the Energy Committee and advisor to the Water Council. He is responsible for developing programs of consultations for mayors with the White House, Congress, and industry on water and clean energy issues and water infrastructure investments. Richard, thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
We can hear you fine. Thank you for joining us, Richard.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and I appreciate being here to give my remarks. I appreciate everybody's time, and I would echo Jason in his tribute to our military families and those who serve. Thank you very much. I'm a consultant, short-term consultant to the Conference of Mayors for 21 years. My portfolio is utilities, energy, and water. I come from the waste energy-ish industry and was very active in the dioxin reassessment for 20 years before I came to the Conference of Mayors and when I worked with them. So we have, in my background, I've had a lot of experience with plastics. I'm not afraid of plastics. I think they play a very big role, vinyl as well. So I'm here to talk about what's likely to happen next year with infrastructure spending on water and sewer utilities. When I say sewer, I mean wastewater and sewer. They're really separate operations in the same plant most of the time. The easy answer to what's going to happen with the COVID-19 recession is nobody knows yet. But I think if you look at the financial footprint of what happened last time in the Great Recession, it does uncover some of the things we need to know about what will happen. So if we could move to the next slide, please. All right, so you start with National League of Cities, the Conference of Mayors, and the National Association of Counties has put together information on what the early impacts of COVID-19 are. And there is generally a slowdown in capital spending across the board. Capital spending for water and sewer utilities is part of it. It's not all of it, and that's the important thing. So I have a somewhat positive story with some uncertainties and some areas to look at. What happened last time, Great Recession, 2007, 2009, it was about 2 years. And you can see on this graph that shows our spending, which is public expenditure and revenues. The blue lines for water, the other lines for sewer. And you can see something very important. The long-term trend is that revenues continue to be positive over time. COVID-19, we have an immediate revenue hit, and we don't know how long that's going to be. So will this recession match what happened in the Great Recession? When I look at this chart, understand that spending will sputter in some areas, not totally, and that revenues will continue to stay positive. They have not gone negative. What affects that is the unemployment rate. and whatever government intervention programs. We'll come to that. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is very quickly, if you look at the blue and green trends, you will see early on that they far outreach GDP. But then when you come to the Great Recession period, you now see spending on water and sewer dipping below GDP. That's an important change. It's a sea change. Next slide, please. So I looked at breaking the Great Recession periods pre and post in order to determine how much are we actually spending on these utilities. Now, this is a total spend on utilities for the nation. This is aggregate data. There are 16,000 wastewater and sewer treatment plants. There are about 150,000 regulated community water supplies. So I looked at the expansion years, 93 to 2008, and you can see we're over 5% growth year over year. When the recession hit, it's cut in half. Interesting, the spend percentage of growth is always above GDP. But you can see what happened in the post-recession period. It took a hit. Next slide, please. So I wanted to look just at construction because when we look at spending for water and sewer, our main categories are chemicals, energy, labor, of course, with payroll, and construction. Construction is the proxy for infrastructure investment. And I looked at construction spending over this period, and you can see, unlike revenues, the spending actually decreases. But how much does it decrease? You can clearly see the trowel. The important things to understand is that you have sustained construction spending between 30 and 40 billion after the recession. And that's at a higher rate than the much earlier years, 93 to 2004, 2005. So even the after effects of the recession, you have a market of 30 to 40 billion in construction. Next slide, please. What happened to the construction money? Again, the same pre and post recession periods, you can see that the hit on construction was absolutely catastrophic. We're down to less than 1% for both water and sewer. Now, what does that mean? That means that it grew less than 1% each year in the post-recession period. It did not necessarily decline. It declined in some years. It went negative in year over year, but average it out over time and you're slightly positive. So you're slightly positive in the worst years after the recession. Next slide, please. All right, here is when we look at the kinds of things that Vinyl Institute would be interested in terms of pipes. And we see that 10.4 billion on sewer line and pumps and about 3.3 billion on wastewater lines and drains. The other two trend lines are on the plants themselves. I'm sure you have some construction product applications there, but the pipes, the PVC, you could see that it took a hit, but it came back. And this data only goes up to 2019. So the question is really two questions. How much did we lose from the expansion years to the post-recession years? Does that tell us what to expect for the COVID-19 recession? So let's look at the next slide, please. Okay, this is the water lines and the water pumps. The previous slide was on the wastewater and sewer side. So you can see you still have 7.5 billion in 2019. In the trough years, however, When we look at pumps, water pumps, along with reservoirs, wells, and tanks and towers, they're basically down between a half to a billion a year. Put them all together, they're 3 or 4 billion. Now, I didn't really look too deeply at those because they're consistent spending. So next slide, please. All right, the key factors that we have in common here between the two recessions, now that we've ascertained that spending takes a hit, revenues are less than we expect, construction continues to grow, but at a retarded level, and the two most important things are unemployment and government intervention. So if we could have the next slide, please. Okay, unemployment, as you can see, in 2007 to 2009, the Great Recession ended in June of 2009. The highest level of unemployment was 9.7%. 4 months after the Great Recession, October of 2009, unemployment hit 10%. So that's sort of a bellwether number to look at and compare it to the unemployment rate that we're facing now with 2020. So I listed BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics here. March of 2020, 4.4%. March of 2019, 3.6%. So you see year over year, when March hit, March 13 was the emergency declaration. So they had a very big impact with the first wave of layoffs, if you will. By April, we're at 14.7. Then you can see we're steadily down, 7.9 in September, and BLS reported, I believe it was last week, 6.9% unemployment in October. So we can see that the trend of unemployment rates declining is matching the trend of declining unemployment rates in the Great Recession. That gives me some comfort that what we will see will be something close to the last time. Next slide, please. The other thing that's important is government intervention programs, and this is the big uncertainty. Consumers are going to hit several cliffs in the next several months. So you have CDC has an emergency declaration which prevents evictions for renters and those with mortgage payments who can't make the payments. And that will be ended by December of this year, and maybe even before that, because there are legal cases pending that challenge the CDC's ability to do that. So that's an uncertainty, but we do know this: once those eviction moratoria end, a lot of people are not going to be using their water. They're going to be going to centers for homeless. Moratoria, mandated or voluntary, on the housing evictions and shutoffs for non-payment of sewer and water bills are starting to occur now. The most likely outcome, there's two outcomes, a most likely outcome and an extreme outcome. I think the most likely outcome is really, as I describe it, is going to be not mild, but not severe. So next slide, please. So utility budgets will emphasize the primary mission, continuity of operations. And the reason for that is very simple. The mission of local water and sewer is to provide public health and safety and support for local economics. It has not been since the 70s growth in national legislation, which then required that local governments that provide utilities have to comply with the Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act, and other acts. And these are to achieve national standards. So local government, just like you in industry, We build these things to do a basic service, and then we are hit with federal mandates to comply with national clean water goals. And we were very happy to do this the first 2 decades, and now we're scratching our head and saying, why were we so liberal? Because the federal mandates are killing us. What else happens? What we saw with 2007-2009 recession, the aftermath was 12 to 15 years of reduced infrastructure investment. My simple estimate is that $105 billion was not invested that would normally have been invested during expansion years. 105 billion less at a time when there's a general consensus that $700 billion to $1 trillion is needed to improve our water and sewer infrastructure. That includes our lines, that includes our pipes. We work at the Conference of Mayors Water Council with Unibel PVC pipe, plastic pipe industry, and American Chemistry Council, several divisions. And we look to them to help us make sense out of policies and practices. And what we find is that when you have this reduction in infrastructure spending, the plastic pipe industry and the ductile industry and the concrete industry are in a really fierce competitive market. The other things that we find with reduced construction is a labor freeze. We look for attrition, buyouts, furloughs, then layoffs. And then prioritization, really reprioritizing capital projects in construction. So next slide, please. What's the most likely outcome? Sustained construction investment at the 40 billion plus annually. That's going to include some 20 billion for pipes. Okay, the rest of it's going to be for plant, reservoir, tanks, towers, etc. So half of that growth is going to be in pipes. So the basic market demand is going to be there. Growth in construction spending will again take a haircut, and we don't know how bad. And here's one of the reasons why. If you have a relief bill that is passed and there is money in there for states and cities, we are working with the House leadership for a $500 billion infusion to help make up revenues at the local and state level so that we don't end up in debt and legal turmoil and can continue to operate. And if we don't get that, what we're likely to look at is another 200 billion loss in water and sewer utility infrastructure growth. Okay, we're still going to have our 40 billion spend on construction annually. Half of that will be in pipes, but it'll continue with what I call muscle memory. What the managers learned in contracting budgets is not changing. In fact, when you go back and look at the graphs, by 2019, we started to getting construction investment levels that we saw in 2007. But because of inflation, that value was only worth what it was worth in 2005. So there's a good 10 to 15 years of stunted growth. And if we have the same, we will have successfully missed a full generation of needed investment. Next slide, please. Okay, what's the outlier? The outlier is the individuals hit the cliff. They don't pay their bills. Every big wastewater system, every big water system is going to have either a bond or a loan. If it's a loan to a bank, they need to apply for forbearance. If it's a loan to the state revolving fund, There's some help on the way, but they will have to ask for both forbearance and forgiveness and extension of payments. Why is this an issue? It's an issue if you have a bond, because the last tax bill said you can no longer do advance refunding. What would we normally do? If hit with a big financial problem, we would refinance. We can't do that cheaply anymore, even though the interest rate on loans and bonds are at historic lows. This is a problem. This is a problem that Congress can fix. If you hold a state revolving loan, can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, the worst thing that will happen is if we have to shut down the plants, you can't shut them down. The worst is not going to happen. What's going to happen is the National Guard will be called in to operate these plants. A lot of them are automated. They're still going to need civilian guidance, skill, and expertise to do that. And that's what will happen in the worst case. The most likely case is we're going to have to face what we do with shutoffs over the next 6 months. And why is this an issue? In the last Great Recession, a few years after that, the great city of Detroit declared bankruptcy. Now, there was issues with management and finance, but there was also the issue that Michigan is a state that does not have a growing population, and it has a declining industrial base that the leaders are struggling to make right. One of the papers that I shared with Susan and Sarah and Jen was one on what are we spending on water infrastructure in the 8 Great Lakes states. And I would advise you to look at that because it is the poster child story of how our ability with one fiscal base to solve local and national problems is flawed. And we need to go back and rethink how we do environmental programs. We're spending at our lowest 40% households 6 to 12% of their income on water and sewer utility bills. So what is a problem for the mayors is while we agree with environmental improvements, we want wonderful water, we want good sanitation, we don't want sewer overflows, we have to get all the money to accomplish that from our fiscal base. Our fiscal base is also taxed by the state, by the federal government, and 45,000 special government districts that have taxation authority by becoming local governments as special districts. We are not out of the woods to figure all this out. I think what's nice on the upcoming side is that the Senate Appropriations Bill was just released, and the Senate Appropriations is the lowest level of funding compared to the House Appropriations for water and sewer. And so if you take that, that gives you the floor from which the Senate and the Democrats and Republicans will be debating to come up from. And what are they? 1.6 billion in the state revolving fund, capitalization grants to the states to give to cities as loans. Very important provision. 10% of it has to be for green infrastructure, energy, or water efficiency improvements. If your product has a play, you're in the 10% game. For the drinking water SRF, 1.1 billion capitalization grants to the states to be given out for loans a proviso. 14% of that money can be used for green infrastructure, utilizing energy efficiency and water efficiency technology. So again, if you're in that category, there's money to be gotten there. Another eligibility for the drinking water SRF under that same 14% is high priority to cities that have lead pipes to the house. That money can be used to help defray the cost for the city utilities to replace those lines. Those lines are going to be replaced with copper unless there is an HDPE or another plastic pipe solution. But they will get special access to this money. There are about 12 million households with lead pipes leading from the trunk main line into the household, and it's on private property. Special arrangements are being made so that this can be accomplished. So the bottom line is this. If the Senate is coming out with this appropriation proposal, it's either going to stay at that level or it's going to go a little bit higher. But that's appropriations, and that's my other message to you. This is going to come, the relief for utilities is going to come funnel through existing funding channels like the state revolving fund. We may get something from a big relief package, but your utilities, like every other department, will get in line for a piece of that, and they're all going to take a haircut. We just don't know how much. I've spoken over, and I'll be quiet, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. This is Kevin Kuntz with the VI. That was great. And yes, we're a little bit short on time. We appreciate that. We are told that there will be an omnibus appropriations bill in December that will include COVID relief. So hopefully the state and local number will be as close to 500 billion as you point out. And it'll be interesting to see, because after all, this recession was man-made, right? I mean, pardon the pun, but the government basically turned the switch off. So there wasn't anything fundamentally wrong with the economy except for this virus, which hopefully, according to Dr. Fauci, we could begin to see the vaccine being distributed by the end of the year. So thank you for that in-depth analysis and for all the information that you provided us. The white papers will be distributed or available to participants. And thanks for where the mayors are on open competition. We appreciate that help with the duck telephone. So thank you.